Edith inherited her late husband's antique shop, a dusty place, filled with memories, but it was Maisie, her golden retriever, who sniffed out something far more valuable than memories. A secret fortune buried under a pile of old maps. How will she protect it? Wade Anderson thought inheriting a worthless desert scrapyard was the final insult from his late commanding officer. But when his German Shepherd Duke began frantically digging beneath a pile of twisted metal in the Arizona heat, everything changed. What they unearthed from the sand wasn't just another piece of aviation junk. It was a perfectly preserved experimental aircraft worth $400 million, a military secret buried for 70 years. But their discovery would awaken ruthless corporate hunters who would stop at nothing to claim the prize, forcing a broken veteran and his loyal dog to fight the most important battle of their lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Heat waves shimmered across the cracked asphalt of Highway 47 as Wade Anderson's rusted pickup truck wheezed to a stop before a chain-link fence that stretched endlessly into the Arizona desert. The thermometer on his dashboard read 112, but the real heat came from the anger burning in his chest. Beside him in the passenger seat, Duke lifted his massive head and let out a soft whine, his amber eyes reflecting the concern that seemed to perpetually shadow his master's movements. Wade was 52 years old, though the lines etched deep around his eyes and the premature silver threading through his brown hair made him look older. His broad shoulders carried the weight of too many battles fought and too many brothers lost. The faded army tattoo on his forearm bore witness to 20 years of service that had ended not with honor, but with a medical discharge and a prescription bottle that rattled in his shirt pocket like dice in a losing gamble. His worn jeans and flannel shirt hung loose on his frame, evidence of the appetite that had abandoned him along with his sense of purpose. "Well, Duke," he said, his voice rough as sandpaper, "this is it. Our big inheritance." Duke's ears perked forward as he studied the desolate landscape beyond the fence. The German Shepherd was a magnificent animal, 6 years old, with a coat of rich sable and black that gleamed even in the harsh desert sun. His intelligent eyes missed nothing, a trait that had made him invaluable during their deployments together in Afghanistan. Now in civilian life, those same eyes watched Wade with the devotion of a creature who understood that his human was fighting an invisible war. The scrapyard sprawled across 40 acres of desert floor, a monument to mechanical decay. Twisted automobile frames rose from the sand like the skeletons of prehistoric beasts. Aircraft parts, everything from wing sections to engine housings, lay scattered in seemingly random patterns. A few mobile homes and metal storage buildings dotted the property, their paint sand blasted away by years of desert wind. In the distance, mountains rose purple and forbidding against the cloudless sky. Wade pulled out the letter that had arrived 3 weeks ago, its formal legal language still foreign to his understanding. The law firm of Henderson, Price and Associates had informed him that Colonel Robert Mitchell, his former commanding officer, had died and left him the desert wind scrapyard in Copper Falls, Arizona. No explanation, no sentiment, just the deed and a set of keys that now fell heavy in his calloused palm. He had known Colonel Mitchell for 15 years, from his early days as a green mechanic, fresh out of basic training to his final deployment as a staff sergeant. Mitchell had been a fair man, demanding but never cruel, the kind of officer who inspired loyalty through example rather than fear. But they hadn't spoken in over 5 years, not since Wade's discharge. The inheritance made no sense. "Probably felt sorry for us," Wade muttered to Duke as he climbed out of the truck. The heat hit him like a physical blow, and sweat immediately began to bead on his forehead. Duke bounded out after him, his paws finding purchase on the rocky ground with the sure-footed grace of a working dog. The gate was secured with a heavy chain and padlock. Wade found the right key on the ring and struggled with the corroded mechanism for several minutes before it finally gave way with a metallic shriek. The gate swung open on protesting hinges, and they stepped into their new domain. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the debris and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. This trained eye began cataloging what he saw. Most of the cars were beyond salvage, rusted hulks that would be worth more as scrap metal than transportation. The aircraft parts were more intriguing, though he couldn't identify most of them. Some looked military, others civilian, all weathered by decades of exposure. "Nothing but junk," he said aloud, though his voice lacked conviction. There was something about this place, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It felt like a battlefield after the smoke had cleared, full of ghosts and unfinished business. Duke had wandered away, his nose working the ground in the methodical pattern Wade recognized from their explosive detection work. The dog moved with purpose, weaving between the larger pieces of debris toward the far end of the property. Wade followed, his boots crunching on the grubby sand. They passed a partially buried aircraft engine, its propeller blades twisted into abstract sculptures by some long-ago impact. A section of fuselage bore the faded star and bar insignia of the U.S. Air Force. Wade paused to examine it more closely, running his fingers over the metal. It was old, probably from the Korean War era, but the construction was solid. Someone had put care into building this machine. Duke's barking broke his reverie. The dog was 50 yards away, pointing frantically at a section of ground that looked no different from the rest. His tail was rigid, his body language screaming urgency in a way Wade had learned never to ignore. "What is it, boy?" Wade called, jogging toward his companion. Duke rarely got excited about anything these days. The war had changed them both, turning a once playful puppy into a serious, watchful guardian. When he reached Duke's position, Wade could see what had captured the dog's attention. The ground here was slightly different. The sand more compacted, arranged in a rough rectangular pattern about 30 feet long and 15 feet wide. It was subtle, the kind of thing only a trained eye would notice. But once seen, unmistakable. Duke continued to dig, his powerful claws sending sprays of sand and small rocks flying. His whines had taken on a different quality, more urgent, almost frantic. Wood had seen this behavior before in the field when Duke had detected something important buried beneath the surface. "Easy, Duke, let me take a look." Wade knelt beside his dog and began brushing away the loose sand with his hands. The ground was hard-packed beneath the surface layer as if it had been deliberately prepared. His fingers found something solid metallic about 6 and down. He cleared more sand away, revealing a section of what looked like aluminum sheeting. His pulse quickened. This wasn't random debris scattered by wind and time. This was something buried with intention, something hidden. He returned to his truck and retrieved a folding shovel from the toolkit in the bed. Duke watched eagerly as Wade began to dig in earnest, following the outline his dog had discovered. The metal surface was larger than he had initially thought, extending in both directions beyond his excavation. After an hour of careful digging, fighting the relentless sun and his own growing exhaustion, Wade had exposed enough of the buried object to understand what they had found. It was an aircraft, but not like any he had ever seen. The wing design was unusual, swept back at an angle that spoke of high-speed flight. The metal was pristine beneath its sandy grave, protected from decades of weathering. He sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his eyes, trying to process what he was seeing. This wasn't scrap. This wasn't some discarded piece of military surplus. This was something else entirely, something that had been hidden here for a very long time. Duke sat beside him, panting but alert, his mission accomplished. Wade reached out and scratched behind the dog's ears, feeling a surge of gratitude for his four-legged partner's instincts. "Good boy," he said softly. "I think you just found us something important." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Wade continued his careful excavation. Each shovelful of sand revealed more of the aircraft's sleek profile. The cockpit canopy was intact, its surface clouded but unbroken. Strange markings along the fuselage suggested this was an experimental design, something that had never entered regular service. The implications began to dawn on him as he worked. This wasn't just an old airplane. This was a piece of aviation history, possibly classified, buried in a remote scrapyard where no one would think to look. The question that knotted him was why Colonel Mitchell had left him this place. Had the old man known what was hidden here? Was this inheritance random charity or something more deliberate? Duke had settled into a watchful pose nearby, his ears constantly moving as he monitored their surroundings. The desert seemed peaceful, but Wade's military training had taught him that appearances could be deceiving. If this aircraft was as significant as it appeared, they weren't the only ones who might be interested in it. As darkness approached, Wade reluctantly covered his excavation with a tarp from his truck, weighing down the edges with rocks. He would need proper equipment to fully uncover the aircraft, and he would need answers about what exactly he had inherited. But for now, he and Duke would drive into Copper Falls to find a place to spend the night and plan their next move. The town of Copper Falls was a collection of low buildings clustered around a single main street. The kind of place that existed primarily to serve the needs of travelers passing through on their way to somewhere more important. A few streetlights cast pools of yellow light on the empty sidewalks. The only sign of life was the warm glow spilling from the windows of a diner called Morrison's Roadhouse. Dee parked his truck and clipped Duke's leash to his collar. Most establishments wouldn't welcome a large dog, but he hoped a small desert town might be more accommodating, especially for a working animal with the calm demeanor Duke projected. The diner's interior was exactly what he expected: red vinyl booths, a long counter with chrome stools, and the lingering aroma of coffee and fried food. A woman in her mid-40s stood behind the counter, her brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She looked up as they entered, her expression curious but not unwelcoming. "Evening," she said, her voice carrying the warm drawl of someone who had lived in the desert her entire life. "You must be the new owner of the Mitchell place." Wade raised an eyebrow. "Word travels fast," she smiled, extending a hand across the counter. "Beth Morrison, I own this place. And in a town of 800 people, everything travels fast." "Coffee, please." Wade settled onto a stool, Duke lying quietly at his feet. "Wade Anderson, how did you know about the inheritance?" Beth poured him a cup of black coffee from a glass pot. the steam rising in aromatic spirals. Bob Mitchell was a regular here for 20 years. Came in every Tuesday for meatloaf and talked about everything except what he did out at that scrapyard. When the lawyers came through last month settling his affairs, they mentioned he'd left the place to a fellow veteran. Wade sipped the coffee, feeling the caffeine begin to cut through his exhaustion. Did you know him well? As well as anyone, I suppose. He was a private man, but fair, paid his bills, tipped well, never caused trouble. Lost his wife, Linda, about 10 years ago and kind of withdrew after that. Beth studied Wade's face with the frank assessment of someone accustomed to reading people. He talked about you though, said you were the best mechanic he ever served with. The words hit Wade unexpectedly, stirring emotions he thought he had buried. He said that more than once, said you could fix anything with an engine and had the kind of integrity that was rare in any profession. Beth leaned against the counter, her manner becoming more serious. He also said, you'd been through some hard times since leaving the service. Wade's jaw tightened. His struggles weren't a secret, but he didn't like them being discussed by strangers. I'm managing, I'm sure you are. Beth's tone remained gentle, non-judgmental, but Bob worried about you. I think that's why he left you the place. He believed everyone deserved a second chance. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another customer, a man in an expensive suit that looked completely out of place in the desert diner. He was tall and lean with silver hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to catalog everything in the room with predatory efficiency. He took a seat 3 stools down from Wade and ordered coffee. Wade felt Duke tense beside him, the dog's body language shifting into alert mode. The German Shepherd's instincts were finely tuned to threat assessment, and something about the newcomer had triggered his warning systems. First time in Copper Falls? Beth asked the man as she poured his coffee. Business trip. He replied, his voice smooth and cultured. I represent some investors interested in local properties. Development opportunities. Wade felt a chill that had nothing to do with the diner's air conditioning. He finished his coffee and stood, dropping a $10 bill on the counter. Thanks for the coffee, Beth. I'll see you around. You staying at the Broken Wheel? She asked, referring to the town's only motel, for tonight. As Wade and Duke headed for the door, he heard Beth's voice behind him addressing the man in the suit. If you're looking at the old scrapyard, you should know it's not for sale. Just got a new owner. Wade didn't wait to hear the response, but Duke's continued alertness as they walked to the truck told him everything he needed to know. Their discovery had somehow attracted attention, and their quiet inheritance had just become complicated. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Broken Wheel Motel lived up to its name in every possible way. Wade's room smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial disinfectant, its thin walls allowing him to hear every sound from the highway traffic beyond. Duke had claimed the small patch of carpet near the door, positioning himself as always between Wade and any potential threat. The air conditioning unit wheezed and rattled, providing just enough cooling to make sleep theoretically possible. Wade lay on the sagging mattress, staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles, his mind racing despite his physical exhaustion. The buried aircraft dominated his thoughts. Its sleek profile unlike anything in his mechanical experience. The precision of its construction suggested military origins, but the design elements were unfamiliar, almost futuristic. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to hide it, and Colonel Mitchell had somehow acquired the property where it lay concealed. Sleep proved elusive. Every time Wade closed his eyes, he saw the mysterious businessman from the diner, those calculating blue eyes that had assessed him like a target. Duke's continued restlessness didn't help. The dog kept lifting his head, ears pricked toward sounds only he could detect. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, Duke's low growl brought Wade fully awake. The German Shepherd was standing now, his body ridged with tension, facing the room's single window. Wade rolled silently from the bed, his hand automatically reaching for the pistol he kept in his travel bag. Years of military discipline had never left him, and Duke's warnings were never false alarms. He crept to the edge of the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. The motel parking lot was dimly lit by a single buzzing street light, casting long shadows between the handful of parked vehicles. At first, Wade saw nothing unusual. Then movement caught his eye. A dark sedan idling at the far end of the lot, its headlights off but its engine running. Wade watched for 10 minutes, but the vehicle never moved. Its occupants remained invisible behind tinted windows, but their presence felt threatening in the empty desert night. When he finally returned to bed, Duke positioned himself directly against the door, his amber eyes reflecting the faint light from the parking lot. Dawn brought no relief from the heat, but it did reveal that the mysterious sedan had vanished. Wade packed his few belongings quickly, eager to return to the scrapyard and continue his investigation. Duke seemed equally anxious to leave, his usual morning routine abbreviated by an urgency that matched his master's mood. Beth Morrison was already serving coffee to early shift workers when Wade and Duke entered the diner. Her smile seemed genuine, but Wade noticed her eyes scanning his face with concern. Rough night, she asked, pouring him coffee without being asked. Couldn't sleep. Too much to think about. Wade accepted the steaming cup gratefully. Tell me about the local business community. Anyone particularly interested in real estate development? Beth's expression grew cautious. Why do you ask? Had a visitor last night. Dark sedan, tinted windows, sitting in the motel parking lot for hours. The kind of surveillance I recognize from my military days. That's troubling. Beth glanced around the diner, ensuring their conversation remained private. There have been rumors lately about outside investors sniffing around. Nothing concrete, but enough to make people nervous. This area has always been ignored by developers because there's nothing here worth developing. Wade leaned forward, lowering his voice. What if there was something worth developing? Something valuable enough to attract serious attention? Before Beth could respond, the diner's bell chimed as a new customer entered. Wade recognized him immediately. A man in his late 30s with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses carrying a worn leather briefcase. He had the earnest, slightly rumpled appearance of an academic. Dr. Paul Richardson, the newcomer said, approaching Wade's seat at the counter. I believe we need to talk. Wade's hand instinctively moved toward the concealed pistol under his jacket. About what? About what you found yesterday at the scrapyard, Doctor. Richardson's voice was quiet but urgent. May I sit down? This is important. Duke's assessment of the stranger seemed neutral, alert, but not hostile. Wade gestured to the adjacent stool, though he remained ready to move quickly if necessary. Dr. Richardson settled beside him, ordering coffee from Beth before turning his full attention to Wade. I'm an aviation historian with the Phoenix Museum of Flight. For the past 15 years, I've been researching a classified military project from the early 1950s called Operation Silverwing. The name meant nothing to Wade, but something in the historian's manner suggested it should never heard of it. Very few people have. It was a joint venture between the Air Force and several private contractors to develop advanced aircraft designs. The project produced 3 prototype aircraft before being abruptly cancelled in 1952. 2 of the prototypes were supposedly destroyed. The third disappeared entirely from the historical record. Wade felt his pulse quicken. What made these aircraft special? Dr. Richardson glanced around nervously before continuing. They incorporated design elements that were decades ahead of their time. Advanced metallurgy, revolutionary aerodynamics, experimental propulsion systems. If one of those prototypes survived intact, it would be worth. He paused, seeming to struggle with the magnitude of the number. Conservative estimates put the value at $400 million, not just for the aircraft itself, but for the technological innovations it contains. The figure hit Wade like a physical blow. $400 million. Enough money to solve every problem he had ever faced. Enough to live comfortably for several lifetimes. But the historian's next words tempered his excitement. There are also people who would kill to possess such an aircraft. The technology it represents could be reverse-engineered, potentially giving whoever controls it a significant military or commercial advantage. That's why the project was classified at the highest levels and why its cancellation was covered up so thoroughly. Beth had been listening with growing amazement. Are you saying there's a $400 million airplane buried in Bob Mitchell's scrapyard? I'm saying it's possible. Dr. Richardson turned back to Wade. Colonel Mitchell contacted me 6 months ago. He claimed to have information about the missing prototype, but died before we could meet. When I heard about the inheritance, I knew I had to find you. His mind raced through the implications. Colonel Mitchell had known about the aircraft. The inheritance wasn't random charity. It was a deliberate transfer of an enormously valuable secret. But why hadn't the old man simply sold the aircraft himself? What had prevented him from claiming its worth? If this aircraft is so valuable, Wade said slowly, why hasn't anyone found it before now? Why was Colonel Mitchell sitting on it? Dr. Richardson's expression grew somber. Because claiming ownership of classified military technology is extremely complicated. The government could argue that the aircraft remains federal property regardless of where it's located. Private collectors might resort to theft or violence to acquire it. Colonel Mitchell was probably paralyzed by the same dilemma you're facing now. Duke suddenly lifted his head, his ears swiveling toward the diner's front window. Wade followed his gaze and felt his blood run cold. The same dark sedan from the previous night was parked across the street, its engine running. This time he could make out 2 figures in the front seats. We're being watched, he said quietly. Dr. Richardson followed his gaze and pouted. We need to leave now. There are people who have been searching for that aircraft for decades, and they're not the kind of people who respect legal ownership. Wade stood slowly, his movements casual, despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Is there a back exit? Through the kitchen, her voice was tight with concern. Wade, what have you gotten yourself into? Something bigger than I realized. He dropped a 20 on the counter. If anyone asks, we were never here. The 3 of them moved quickly through the diner's kitchen, Duke's claws clicking on the tile floor. Beth led them through a narrow storage room to a rear exit that opened onto an alley behind the building. This pickup truck was parked on the main street, visible to their watchers. but Dr. Richardson's rental car sat unnoticed behind the neighboring hardware store. "Follow me to the scrapyard," Wade told the historian. "Stay back far enough that they won't connect us, but close enough that you don't get lost. And doctor, I hope you're not afraid of hard work, because we've got some serious digging to do." The return trip to the desert wind scrapyard felt like a tactical movement through hostile territory. Wade kept checking his mirrors, watching for pursuit, while Duke maintained his vigilant position in the passenger seat. Dr. Richardson's rental car stayed a discreet distance behind, barely visible through the heat shimmers rising from the asphalt. The scrapyard looked different in the full light of day, somehow more ominous despite the brilliant sunshine. Wade's excavation site from the previous evening was undisturbed, the tarp still weighted down with rocks. But something felt wrong. Duke confirmed his suspicions by immediately beginning a security sweep of the perimeter, his nose working the ground in systematic patterns. Dr. Richardson arrived 15 minutes later, his rental car coated with dust from the unpaved access road. He climbed out slowly, adjusting his glasses as he surveyed the sprawling collection of mechanical debris. "Incredible," he murmured. "I've read about places like this, but seeing it in person." His voice trailed off as his historian's eye began cataloging the various aircraft parts scattered across the property. Wade led him to the burial site, pulling away the tarp to reveal the partial excavation. Dr. Richardson's breath caught in his throat as he saw the exposed wing section and the distinctive swept-back design. "Dear God," he whispered, "it's real. It's actually real. Help me uncover more of it," Wade said, handing the historian a spare shovel from his truck. "We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with before those people in the sedan decide to pay us a visit." They worked in the blazing heat for the next 3 hours, carefully removing sand and debris from around the aircraft. Duke served as their sentry, positioning himself where he could watch both the access road and the surrounding desert. The German shepherd's calm demeanor provided some reassurance, but Wade knew that their peaceful excavation wouldn't last forever. As more of the aircraft emerged from its sandy grave, Dr. Richardson's excitement became almost palpable. The preservation was remarkable. The desert climate had protected the metal from corrosion, and whoever had buried the craft had done so with obvious care. Strange markings along the fuselage confirmed its experimental nature, while the cockpit design suggested a single pilot configuration. "Look at this," Dr. Richardson said, pointing to a panel near the nose. "Those aren't standard military designations. This bird has a serial number I don't recognize and manufacturing codes that don't match any known contractors from that era." Wade paused in his digging, wiping sweat from his forehead. "What does that mean?" "It means this aircraft was built under deeper cover than even I suspected. Probably by a shell company or through a black-budget program that left no official records." The historian's voice carried a mixture of awe and concern. "This isn't just valuable, Wade, this is historically significant. This could rewrite our understanding of 1950s military aviation development." Their work was interrupted by Duke's sharp bark of warning. The German shepherd had moved to the perimeter of the excavation site, his body language indicating immediate threat. Wade looked up to see a cloud of dust rising from the access road. "Vehicles approaching fast. Company's coming," he said grimly, reaching for the rifle he kept mounted in his truck. "Doctor, get behind those engine blocks over there." "Duke, Hill." 3 black SUVs roared through the open gate of the scrapyard, their tires throwing up clouds of sand as they spread out in a tactical formation. Wade counted at least 8 men as they emerged from the vehicles, all wearing dark clothing despite the desert heat. They moved with military precision, establishing a perimeter around the excavation site with the efficiency of a practice team. Their leader stepped forward, a large man with cold eyes and the build of someone who solved problems with violence. His expensive suit looked out of place in the desert setting, but his bearing suggested he was completely comfortable with confrontation. "Mr. Anderson," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the hot air. "I'm Jack Stone. I represent certain interests that would like to discuss a business proposition with you." Wade kept the rifle at ready position, though he didn't aim it directly at the intruders. Duke stood beside him, every muscle tense for action. "This is private property. You're trespassing." Jack Stone smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "Property ownership is a complex legal concept, Mr. Anderson, especially when that property contains items of national significance. The aircraft belongs to whoever owns the land it's buried on." Dr. Richardson called out from his position behind the engine blocks. His voice wavered slightly, but he stood his ground. "That's established precedent in salvage law." "Ah, the good doctor." Stone's attention shifted to the historian. "Dr. Paul Richardson of the Phoenix Museum of Flight. We've been following your research with great interest. Your academic pursuits have led you to some very dangerous territory." Wade felt the situation spiraling beyond his control. These weren't random criminals or opportunistic scavengers. They were professionals, well-funded and thoroughly prepared. The fact that they knew Dr. Richardson's identity suggested a level of planning that went far beyond casual surveillance. "What do you want?" Wade asked, buying time while he assessed their tactical position. 8 armed men against 1 veteran, 1 academic, and a dog. The odds were not encouraging. Simple cooperation, Stone replied. We want you to continue your excavation under our supervision. When the aircraft is fully recovered, we'll arrange for its transfer to appropriate authorities. In exchange, you'll receive a finder fee of $5 million. $5 million. The offer was staggering, but Wade's military experience had taught him to recognize a lie when he heard one. These people had no intention of paying anything. Once they had what they wanted, he and Dr. Richardson would become liabilities to be eliminated. And if I refuse? Stone's smile widened. I don't think you'll refuse, Mr. Anderson. You see, we've done our research. We know about your financial difficulties, your medical issues, your struggle to adapt to civilian life. We know about the little pills that help you sleep at night, and the nightmares that wake you up. Anyway, we're offering you a chance to solve all of those problems. The personal details hit Wade like physical blows. These people had investigated his entire life, probing into his most private struggles. The violation felt worse than any physical threat. You have 1 hour to consider our offer, Stone continued. We'll be waiting at the gate. Don't try to leave. We have the access road blocked. And don't try to call for help. We're jamming all cell phone signals in a 2-mile radius. The 8 men withdrew to their vehicles with the same military precision they had shown in their arrival. Wade was left standing in the blazing sun, rifle in hand, watching his peaceful inheritance transform into a battleground. Dr. Richardson emerged from his hiding place, his face pale with shock. They're not going to let us live, the historian said quietly. Even if we cooperate, even if we give them everything they want, we know too much. Wade looked down at Duke, who was still maintaining his alert posture despite the apparent withdrawal of the immediate threat. The German shepherd's loyalty was absolute, his courage unquestionable, but courage alone wouldn't be enough to get them out of this situation. Then we better figure out another option, Wade said grimly. Because I didn't survive 3 tours in Afghanistan just to get murdered in an Arizona scrapyard. The hour deadline ticked away like a countdown to execution. Wade crouched in the shade of a stripped aircraft fuselage, studying the terrain around them with tactical eyes, while Dr. Richardson paced nervously nearby. Duke had taken position at the highest point of debris he could find, a twisted crane boom that gave him an elevated view of their surroundings. The German shepherd's keen senses would provide their only early warning system. There has to be something we can do, Dr. Richardson muttered, adjusting his glasses for the 100th time. Some legal authority we can contact. Some way to get help. Wade shook his head grimly. They're jamming communications, and even if we could call out, who would we call? By the time any law enforcement could respond, we'd be dead. And that aircraft would be gone. He gestured toward the black SUVs visible at the gate. These aren't amateurs, Doc. They've planned this operation down to the last detail. The historian stopped pacing and looked directly at Wade. Then what do you suggest? We can't fight 8 armed professionals. We can't fight them head-on. Wade agreed. But this is my property now, and I know something they don't. He pointed toward the maze of corroded machinery stretching across the 40-acre site. Colonel Mitchell didn't just buy this place randomly. Look at the layout, the positioning of the larger debris. This isn't random dumping. It's defensive terrain, Doctor. Richardson squinted across the scrapyard, trying to see what Wade saw. I don't understand. Mitchell was military intelligence before he became my commanding officer. He chose this spot because it could be defended. Wade's voice carried the confidence of a soldier analyzing familiar ground. Those crane booms create natural choke points. The aircraft fuselages provide cover and concealment. The whole layout channels movement into predictable patterns. Duke's sharp bark interrupted their planning session. The German shepherd was pointing toward the gate, his body ridged with alertness. Wade grabbed his binoculars and focused on the SUVs. Jack Stone had emerged from the late vehicle and was walking toward them, flanked by 2 armed subordinates. Time's up, Wade said quietly. Stay behind me, Doc. Whatever happens, don't try to be a hero. Stone approached with the casual confidence of a man who held all the advantages. His expensive suit was wrinkled now from the desert heat, but his cold smile remained unchanged. The 2 men flanking him moved with the predatory grace of professional killers. Have you reached a decision, Mr. Anderson? Stone called out when he was 30 yards away. I need more time to think, Wade replied, stepping out from behind the fuselage with his hands visible but near his concealed sidearm. This is a big decision. Time is a luxury you don't possess. Stone's voice hardened. My employers are not patient people. They've waited 70 years for this aircraft, and they're not willing to wait any longer. Wade felt a chill despite the blazing heat. 70 years? You're saying someone has been looking for this specific aircraft since 1952? Very good, Mr. Anderson. Yes, there are parties who have maintained interest in Operation Silver Wings since its inception. Parties with significant resources and very long memories. Stone gestured toward the partially excavated aircraft. That prototype represents technology that was revolutionary in its time and remains valuable today. Certain innovations never made it into production models, innovations that could still provide competitive advantages. Dr. Richardson stepped forward despite Wade's warning to stay back. Who are your employers? Which government agency? Stone's laugh was devoid of humor. Government doctor. You have a very naive understanding of how the world works. My employers represent private interests, international consortiums that operate beyond the constraints of national boundaries. They collect rare technologies the way others collect art. What is military training? Screamed Danger. These weren't federal agents or even corporate security. They were mercenaries working for shadow organizations that existed in the spaces between legitimate authority. People who could make problems disappear permanently. What guarantee do I have that you'll honor your payment offer? Wade asked, still buying time while he studied their positions. You have my word, Stone replied smoothly, but more importantly, you have no choice. My men have surrounded this facility. There's no escape route you haven't considered, no cavalry coming to your rescue. Duke's growl from his elevated position suggested otherwise. The German shepherd was looking not at Stone's group, but toward the eastern edge of the property. Wade followed his gaze and felt his heart leap. A dust cloud was rising from the desert, moving fast toward the scrapyard. Someone was coming. Stone noticed his distraction and turned to look. His casual confidence evaporated when he saw the approaching vehicles. Impossible. We have all access routes monitored. 3 pickup trucks emerged from the heat shimmer, bouncing across the rough desert terrain at dangerous speeds. Wade recognized the lead vehicle immediately. Beth Morrison's faded blue Ford, its engine roaring as it navigated between the scattered debris. Behind her came 2 more trucks, their beds filled with armed figures. Looks like the cavalry after all, Wade said with grim satisfaction. Stone was already reaching for his radio, barking orders to his scattered team. All units, we have multiple incoming hostiles from the east. Intercept and neutralize. The peaceful desert erupted into chaos. Gunfire cracked across the scrapyard as Stone's men engaged the newcomers. Beth's truck slewed sideways behind a massive aircraft engine, using it as cover while her passengers bailed out. Wade could see Sheriff Tom Bradley among them, his star glinting in the harsh sunlight as he took position with a hunting rifle. This way, Wade shouted to Dr. Richardson, leading him deeper into the maze of debris. Duke bounded down from his perch, staying close to his master as they navigated between twisted metal sculptures that had once been military aircraft. Stone's team was well trained, but they were fighting on unfamiliar ground against people who knew every piece of cover in the scrapyard. Wade could hear Beth Morrison's voice cutting through the gunfire, directing the townspeople with the authority of someone accustomed to crisis management. Tom, take your people around the left flank. Miguel, cover that approach from the crane. Wade found himself grinting despite the deadly situation. Beth Morrison wasn't just a diner owner. She was a natural leader who had somehow organized a rescue mission in less than an hour. The firefight raged across the scrapyard for 20 minutes. Bullets ricocheting off steel hulks and kicking up geysers of sand. Wade and Dr. Richardson stayed low, moving carefully through the maze while Duke served as their scout. The German shepherd's training proved invaluable, alerting them to the positions of Stone's men and guiding them away from danger. Gradually, the balance shifted in favor of the townspeople. They knew the terrain intimately and fought with the desperation of people defending their community. Stone's mercenaries, despite their superior training and equipment, found themselves outflanked and outmaneuvered. The end came suddenly. Sheriff Bradley's voice boomed across the scrapyard, amplified by a bullhorn he had retrieved from his vehicle. This is the Copper Falls Sheriff's Department. You are surrounded and outgunned. Throw down your weapons and surrender immediately. Stone's response was a burst of automatic weapons fire. But his heart was no longer in the fight. Wade could see it in the man's movements. The subtle shift from aggression to self-preservation. The mercenary leader was calculating odds and finding them increasingly unfavorable. Fall back to the vehicles, Stone shouted to his remaining men. Extraction protocol. The retreat was as professional as their initial assault. Stone's team provided covering fire for each other as they withdrew toward the gate. Their movements coordinated despite the pressure, but Beth Morrison had anticipated their escape route. Miguel Palmer, Karen's father and a man whose union organizing days had taught him about strategic thinking, had positioned himself with 2 other townspeople to block the access road. Stone's SUVs were trapped, their escape route cut off by an ancient bulldozer that Miguel had somehow gotten running. The standoff lasted another 10 minutes before Stone made his final calculation. Outnumbered, outflanked, and trapped, he had no choice but to surrender. One by one, his men threw down their weapons and raised their hands. Sheriff Bradley approached Stone with his weapon drawn, his movements careful but confident. Jack Stone, you're under arrest for trespassing, assault with a deadly weapon, and terroristic threatening. Stone's cold smile never wavered. You have no idea what you're interfering with, Sheriff. My employers have resources that extend far beyond your small-town jurisdiction. Maybe so, Bradley replied calmly, but right now, you're in my jurisdiction, and you've committed felonies against my constituents. Everything else can be sorted out by people above my pay grade. Wade emerged from the maze of debris with Dr. Richardson and Duke. Feeling drained, but victorious, Beth Morrison met them halfway, her face flushed with exertion, but her eyes bright with triumph. "How did you know?" Wade asked. "How did you organize all this so fast?" Beth's smile was fierce with protective pride. "In a town this size, everyone knows everyone. When strange men in expensive suits start asking questions about local properties, word gets around. When those same men start making threats against a veteran who just inherited his commanding officer's legacy," she shrugged, "well, we look after our own here." Sheriff Bradley joined them, his badge catching the afternoon sunlight. "We'll hold Stone and his people on the immediate charges. But Wade, you need to understand this isn't over. These men represent interests with serious resources. They'll make bail, hire expensive lawyers, and come back with legal weapons instead of actual ones." Dr. Richardson nodded grimly. "The sheriff's right. Once word gets out about what we found here, every treasure hunter, government agency, and private collector in the world will descend on this place. The aircraft needs to be properly documented and protected before that happens." Wade looked across the scrapyard, taking in the bullet-scarred debris and the evidence of the battle they had just fought. The peaceful inheritance he had received from Colonel Mitchell had become a war zone, and he was beginning to understand that the fighting had only just begun. "Then we better work fast," he said finally, "because I'm not giving up what Colonel Mitchell left me without a fight. This aircraft stays here until we figure out the right thing to do with it." Duke sat beside him, panting from the heat and excitement, but still alert to their surroundings. The German shepherd's presence was a reminder that some loyalties transcended money and politics. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Wade knew he wouldn't face them alone. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, the Copper Falls community worked together to secure the scrapyard and process Stone's captured mercenaries. It was a victory, but everyone understood it was only the first battle in a war that was far from over. The buried aircraft remained partially exposed, its swept wings catching the golden light of late afternoon. $400 million worth of forgotten technology, waiting patiently in the desert sand for someone to decide its fate. Wade Anderson, a broken veteran who had inherited more than he ever bargained for, stood guard over a secret that could change his life forever if he lived long enough to claim it. 3 days after the firefight, the Desert Wind scrapyard had transformed into something resembling an archaeological dig site. Dr. Richardson had called in favors from colleagues across the country, bringing in a small team of aviation experts and preservation specialists who worked with reverent care to fully expose the buried aircraft. Their excitement was palpable as each hour revealed more of the experimental prototype's revolutionary design. Wade found himself thrust into the role of site supervisor, a position that felt both familiar and overwhelming. His military experience with logistics and personnel management served him well, but the academic world operated by different rules than the Army. The researchers treated the aircraft like a religious artifact, documenting every rivet and measurement with meticulous precision. The propulsion system alone could revolutionize modern aviation, Dr. Lisa Cooper explained as she photographed the engine assembly. The restoration expert from the Smithsonian had arrived on the first available flight, her enthusiasm infectious despite the dangerous circumstances that had brought them together. The intake design suggests they were experimenting with principles that wouldn't be fully understood for another 20 years. Duke had appointed himself guardian of the excavation site, patrolling its perimeter with a dedication of a century. The German shepherd seemed to understand that their discovery was precious, steering clear of the delicate work while maintaining constant vigilance for threats. His presence provided comfort to the research team, many of whom had never worked under the protection of an armed guard. Sheriff Bradley had established a command post in one of the scrapyard's mobile homes, coordinating security with the state police and federal agencies that were taking increasing interest in the situation. The captured mercenaries had been transferred to a federal facility pending investigation, but their employer's identity remained a mystery wrapped in layers of shell companies and international law firms. "We've got problems coming from multiple directions," Bradley explained during their morning briefing. "Jack Stone made bail yesterday through a team of lawyers who flew in from New York. The federal government is making noise about national security implications, and we've got media attention that's growing by the hour." Wade looked up from the intelligence report spread across the makeshift table. "Media," Amanda Foster from the Phoenix Herald broke the story yesterday. "Mysterious aircraft discovered in desert scrapyard made the front page this morning, and it's been picked up by national outlets." Bradley handed him a newspaper, its headline screaming in bold letters about the archaeological discovery of the decade. Dr. Richardson emerged from the excavation site, his clothes covered in dust, but his face glowing with scholarly excitement. "Wade, you need to see this. We found something extraordinary." They walked together to the dig site where the aircraft now lay fully exposed for the first time in 70 years. The prototype was smaller than Wade had expected, perhaps 30 feet in length with a wingspan of 40 feet. Its lines were impossibly sleek, as if it had been designed by someone from the distant future rather than the early 1950s. "Look at the cockpit configuration," Dr. Richardson said, pointing to the transparent canopy. "Single seat, but the instrumentation is unlike anything from that era, and these control surfaces." He gestured to the wing design. "They suggest maneuverability characteristics that shouldn't have been possible with the technology available in 1952. Dr. Cooper joined them, holding a tablet filled with detailed photographs. "We've also found manufacturing stamps that don't match any known contractors from Operation Silverwing. The serial numbers reference a company called Stellar Dynamics, but there's no record of any such corporation ever existing." Wade frowned, studying the mysterious markings. "A front company, almost certainly. But funded by whom and for what ultimate purpose?" Dr. Richardson's academic mind was clearly racing through possibilities. "This aircraft represents technological leaps that seem almost impossible for the time period." Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of a black sedan at the gate. Not one of Stone's vehicles, but something newer and more official. We felt his stomach tighten as he recognized the federal license plates. Two women emerged from the sedan, both dressed in conservative business suits that somehow managed to look both professional and threatening. The older of the two was perhaps 50, with steel gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Her younger companion looked like a lawyer, carrying a briefcase and wearing the expression of someone who solved problems through legal intimidation. "Mr. Anderson," the older woman approached with a badge visible in her hand. "Agent Sarah Kellerman, FBI. This is Assistant U.S. Attorney Karen Palmer. We need to discuss the current situation." Wade noticed that Dr. Richardson had gone pale at the sight of federal authorities. The academic world might operate by different rules, but everyone understood what it meant when the FBI arrived at your doorstep. "What can I do for you, Agent Kellerman?" "You can start by explaining how classified military technology ended up buried on private property in the Arizona desert." Her tone was professional but carried an undertone of skepticism. "The aircraft you've discovered contains design elements that remain classified under current national security protocols." Attorney Palmer stepped forward, opening her briefcase to retrieve a thick document. "Mr. Anderson, this is a federal seizure order. The aircraft and all related materials are now under government control pending a complete security review." Wade felt his anger rising like a tide. "This aircraft was buried on private property that I legally inherited. You can't just take it." "Actually, we can," Palmer replied coolly. "National security interests supersede property rights when classified technologies are involved. The aircraft will be transported to a secure facility where it can be properly evaluated." Dr. Richardson found his voice despite his obvious fear. "Agent Kellerman, this discovery has tremendous historical significance. The academic community has a right to study these technological innovations. The academic community has no rights regarding classified military assets." Dr. Kellerman's tone broke no argument. "Your research team has 30 minutes to gather their personal belongings before the site is sealed." Wade looked around the excavation site, taking in the careful work that Dr. Richardson's team had accomplished over the past 3 days. These people had treated the aircraft with respect and reverence, understanding its historical importance beyond mere monetary value. The thought of federal bureaucrats seizing their discovery and burying it in some classified warehouse made his blood boil. "No," he said quietly. Agent Kellerman raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me," I said no. Wade's voice carried the authority of a man who had faced down enemy fire and lived to tell about it. "You want this aircraft, you'll have to go through proper legal channels. Get a court order from a judge who has jurisdiction over property rights, not some federal seizure warrant that bypasses due process." Palmer's expression hardened. "Mr. Anderson, you're interfering with a federal investigation. That's a serious felony. And you're attempting to steal private property without due process. That's a serious constitutional violation." Wade stepped closer to the federal agents, his military bearing evident in every movement. "I suggest you leave my property immediately." The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Bradley, who had been monitoring their radio traffic from his command post. The local lawman positioned himself carefully between Wade and the federal agents, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. "Agent Kellerman, I wasn't aware the FBI had jurisdiction over property disputes in Copper Falls County." Bradley's tone was respectful but firm. "If you have legal documents that supersede local authority, I'd like to review them before any enforcement action takes place." Kellerman's frustration was evident, but she was clearly unwilling to escalate the situation into a confrontation between federal and local law enforcement. "Sheriff Bradley, this is a matter of national security. Then it should be handled through proper legal channels," Bradley replied evenly. "Mr. Anderson has committed no crimes and his property rights are protected under both state and federal law." Duke had moved to stand beside Wade during the confrontation, his presence a silent reminder that the veteran wasn't entirely alone. The German Shepherd's calm alertness seemed to make the federal agents nervous. as if they recognized in the dog the same disciplined readiness they saw in his master. After several tense minutes, Agent Kellerman made her decision. "This isn't over, Mr. Anderson. We'll be back with proper documentation, and when we return, your cooperation will be expected. When you return with proper legal authority, you'll receive proper cooperation," Wade replied. "Until then, you're trespassing on private property." The federal agents departed with obvious reluctance, leaving behind an atmosphere of tension that seemed to press down on everyone at the dig site. Dr. Richardson slumped against a piece of excavation equipment, his face pale with stress. "Wade, you just declared war on the federal government," he said quietly. "They'll be back with overwhelming force." Maybe Wade agreed, but they'll have to follow the law when they do it. This aircraft was buried on private property, and private property rights still mean something in this country. Sheriff Bradley nodded approvingly. "You did the right thing, Wade. Federal overreach is still overreach regardless of the badges involved." As the afternoon wore on, the research team continued their documentation work with increased urgency. Everyone understood that their time was limited, that federal authorities would return with legal weapons that might be harder to fight than Jack Stone's mercenaries. Dr. Cooper made a discovery that changed everything. While examining the aircraft's instrument panel, she found a sealed compartment containing what appeared to be original design documents and test flight records. The papers were in pristine condition, protected by the same careful preservation that had saved the aircraft itself. "Wait, these documents tell a story that goes far beyond experimental aviation," she said, her voice tight with excitement and concern. "According to these files, the aircraft was never intended for military use. It was designed as a reconnaissance platform for monitoring domestic targets." The implications hit Wade like a physical blow. Domestic surveillance. In 1952, Dr. Richardson studied the documents over Cooper's shoulder, his historian's mind processing the shocking revelations. This explains why Operation Silverwing was cancelled so abruptly. Someone in the government realized they were developing technology that could be used against American citizens. Wade felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like lead armor. The aircraft wasn't just valuable, it was evidence of a government program that had crossed constitutional boundaries 70 years ago. Colonel Mitchell hadn't just left him a fortune. He had left him proof of federal overreach that would embarrass powerful people if it ever became public. "Now I understand why those mercenaries were so determined to get their hands on this thing," he said grimly, "and why the FBI showed up so quickly after this story broke." Duke Sharpbark interrupted their discussion. The German Shepherd was pointing toward the access road where another dust cloud was rising in the distance. More visitors were coming, and Wade had a sinking feeling that the next confrontation would make the previous ones look like friendly disagreements. The battle for the Desert Wind scrapyard was escalating, and Wade Anderson was beginning to realize that he was fighting for more than just his inheritance. He was fighting for the truth about what his government had tried to bury in the Arizona desert 70 years ago. The approaching dust cloud resolved into a convoy of news vans and satellite trucks, their corporate logos bright against the desert landscape. Amanda Foster's newspaper story had triggered a media avalanche that descended on Copper Falls like locusts. Wade watched from his defensive position among the aircraft debris as reporters and camera crews swarmed the scrapyard's perimeter, transforming his quiet inheritance into a circus. "Mr. Anderson, Channel 7 News. Can you comment on reports that you've discovered classified military technology?" "Wade, Phoenix Herald, were you planning to sell the aircraft to private collectors?" "Sir, CNN, what's your response to federal claims that you're harboring stolen government property?" The questions came rapid fire from dozens of voices, creating a cacophony that made Duke's ears flatten against his head. The German Shepherd pressed closer to Wade's side, his protective instincts triggered by the aggressive crowd dynamics. Sheriff Bradley had strung yellow tape around the excavation site, but the barrier felt inadequate against the media pressure building beyond it. Dr. Richardson emerged from the aircraft documentation tent looking chagrined. "Wade, we need to make a decision about public disclosure. Every hour we delay gives the federal government more time to build their legal case for seizure." "What are you suggesting?" "Full transparency. We release everything. The aircraft specifications, the surveillance documents, the whole Operation Silverwing story. Once it's public knowledge, it becomes much harder for anyone to make it disappear." Wade considered the historian's proposal while watching the media circus beyond the tape. Public disclosure would protect the truth, but it would also make enemies of very powerful people. The kind of people who had been searching for this aircraft for 70 years wouldn't appreciate having their secrets exposed on national television. His contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar face. Beth Morrison pushed through the crowd of reporters with the determination of someone accustomed to handling chaos. She carried a thermos of coffee and a plate of sandwiches, practical sustenance for people under siege. "Figured you might be getting hungry," she said, ducking under the police tape. "Town council's meeting tonight to discuss the situation. Everyone wants to know what support you need." Wade accepted the coffee gratefully, surprised by the warmth of community solidarity. Beth, you don't understand what you're getting into. This goes way beyond local politics. Maybe so, but you're one of ours now. That counts for something in Copper Falls. Her expression grew serious. Besides, we've done some digging of our own. Turns out Jack Stone's employers have been buying up property all along this stretch of desert for the past 5 years. They're not just after your aircraft, they're after the whole region. Doctor. Cooper looked up from her documentation work, her face flushed with excitement despite the growing pressure. Wade, you need to see this. We found evidence that there were 3 prototype aircraft. Not just one. The other 2 might be buried somewhere else in this area. The revelation hit Wade like a lightning bolt. If Beth was right about the property acquisitions, and Cooper was right about multiple aircraft, then the forces arrayed against him were playing a much larger game than he had realized. The Desert Wind scrapyard wasn't the prize. It was just one piece of a massive puzzle. Show me, he said, following Cooper to her workstation. The documents she had uncovered painted a picture of a project far more ambitious than anyone had suspected. Operation Silverwing hadn't been a simple experimental program. It had been a comprehensive surveillance network designed to monitor American citizens from the air. 3 aircraft, 3 different surveillance technologies positioned to cover major population centers across the Southwest. According to these flight logs, Cooper explained the aircraft were tested over Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Albuquerque. The surveillance equipment could intercept radio communications, photograph ground targets, and track vehicle movements over wide areas. Dr. Richardson studied the documents with growing amazement. This technology was decades ahead of anything officially acknowledged. If these capabilities existed in 1952, imagine what the government might have developed in secret over the following 70 years. Wade felt the magnitude of the discovery settling around him like a weight. He wasn't just the owner of valuable military hardware. He was the custodian of evidence that could fundamentally alter public understanding of government surveillance capabilities. The oblations reached far beyond historical curiosity into contemporary civil liberties concerns. Duke Sharpbark drew his attention to a new arrival at the gate. A single black limousine had pulled up behind the media vehicles, its tinted windows and government plates suggesting official business. Wade watched as 2 figures emerged. A man in an expensive suit who moved with political authority, and a woman whose bearing suggested high military or intelligence background. Sheriff Bradley intercepted them at the police tape, but after a brief conversation, he escorted them toward the excavation site. His expression was grim, suggesting that these visitors carried credentials that couldn't be easily dismissed. Mr. Anderson, the man said as he approached Congressman William Hayes, House Intelligence Committee. This is Colonel Patricia Crawford, Defense Intelligence Agency. We need to discuss the situation you've created here. Wade studied the newcomers carefully. Congressman Hayes had the smooth polish of a career politician, but Colonel Crawford carried herself with the no-nonsense bearing of a professional soldier. Both look like people accustomed to getting their way through authority rather than force. Congressman, Colonel, I assume you're here about the aircraft. We're here about a potential national security catastrophe. Crawford replied bluntly. The documents you've discovered contain information that remains classified at the highest levels. Their public disclosure could compromise ongoing intelligence operations. The Somorskis. Hayes smiled with practiced political charm. However, we recognize your property rights and your service to this country. We're prepared to offer a reasonable solution that protects both national security and your financial interests. I'm listening. The government will purchase the aircraft and all related materials for $50 million, Hayes said smoothly. In addition, we'll arrange for a substantial consulting contract that would provide ongoing income for your archaeological team. Everyone benefits. You receive financial security. Dr. Richardson's people get funding for legitimate research and sensitive information remains protected. $50 million. The offer was staggering. Enough money to solve every problem Wade had ever faced and provide security for the rest of his life. But the strings attached were obvious. Take the money and disappear, leaving the truth buried in classified files where it couldn't embarrass anyone. Dr. Richardson was studying the politicians with academic skepticism. What guarantees do we have that the aircraft would be preserved for historical study rather than simply destroyed to eliminate evidence? Colonel Crawford's expression hardened. Doctor, you're discussing classified materials. The disposition of those materials is not subject to academic oversight. Which means you plan to destroy it, Wade said quietly. Which means we plan to protect national security, Hayes corrected. Sometimes that requires difficult decisions about historical artifacts. Wade looked around the excavation site, taking in the careful work that had brought the aircraft back to light after 70 years of concealment. Dr. Richardson's team had treated it with reverence, understanding its significance beyond monetary value. The thought of powerful men in Washington ordering its destruction to protect their secrets made his blood run cold. The answer is no, he said firmly. Hayes' political smile faltered slightly. Mr. Anderson, I don't think you fully understand the forces you're dealing with. There are national security implications that go far beyond your personal situation. I understand perfectly. You want to buy my silence and destroy evidence of government overreach that occurred 70 years ago. Wood's voice carried the authority of a man who had faced down enemy fire and survived. But this aircraft doesn't just belong to me. It belongs to the American people who were spied on without their knowledge or consent. Colonel Crawford stepped forward, her military bearing evident in every movement. Mr. Anderson, you're a veteran. You understand the importance of operational security. Some secrets must be kept for the greater good. I also understand the Constitution I swore to defend, and that Constitution doesn't have an exception clause for government convenience. The confrontation was interrupted by commotion from the media area. Amanda Foster had somehow obtained copies of the surveillance documents and was broadcasting their contents live on national television. Her voice carried clearly across the desert air as she described the implications of Operation Silverwing. What we're seeing here represents one of the most significant revelations about government surveillance capabilities in American history. She was saying to a camera crew, documents discovered at this site suggest that the federal government was conducting domestic aerial surveillance operations decades before such programs were officially acknowledged. Hayes and Crawford exchanged sharp glances, their careful political approach suddenly derailed by public disclosure. The cat was out of the bag and no amount of money or threats could put it back. You've made a serious mistake, Mr. Anderson, Crawford said coldly. There are consequences for releasing classified information, regardless of how it was obtained. Wade felt Duke press against his leg. The German shepherd's presence a reminder that some loyalties transcended politics and power. Oh no, the only mistake here was the government thinking it could bury the truth in the desert and forget about it. As the afternoon wore on, the media circus intensified. News helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures, their cameras capturing every detail of the archaeological site. The story was spreading across social media platforms faster than authorities could control it. With hashtags like Desert Truth and Surveillance Gate trending nationally, Dr. Richardson worked with increased urgency to document everything before federal authorities could intervene with force. His team understood that they were racing against time, that their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Wade Cooper called from the aircraft cockpit where she had been examining the instrumentation. There's something else here, a data storage device that wasn't in the original documentation. Wade joined her at the aircraft where she had discovered a sealed compartment containing what appeared to be an early form of magnetic tape storage. The device was unlike anything from the 1950s, suggesting technological capabilities that had never been publicly acknowledged. If this contains recorded surveillance data, Richardson said, studying the device with fascination, it could provide concrete evidence of what the government was actually monitoring. Wade realized that they had moved beyond historical discovery into contemporary political dynamite. The aircraft wasn't just evidence of past government overreach. It potentially contained proof of illegal surveillance operations that could embarrass powerful people still alive today. The battle for the Desert Wind scrapyard had become a fight for the truth about American democracy itself. And Wade Anderson, a broken veteran who had inherited more than he bargained for, found himself at the center of a constitutional crisis that would determine whether some truths were too dangerous for the American people to know. The data storage device sat on Dr. Cooper's examination table like an unexploded bomb, its implications radiating through the research team with mounting tension. The magnetic tape system was decades ahead of its supposed 1952 origin date, suggesting technological development programs that had operated in complete secrecy. Wade watched Cooper's careful analysis while Duke maintained his vigilant patrol of the excavation perimeter, the German shepherd's instincts clearly detecting the rising danger around them. This is incredible, Cooper murmured, using specialized tools to examine the device's construction. The magnetic density and recording mechanism suggest data storage capabilities that shouldn't have existed until the 1970s. If this tape contains actual surveillance recordings, it would prove everything. Dr. Richardson finished, his voice thick with academic excitement and growing dread. Concrete evidence of domestic spying operations conducted without congressional oversight or public knowledge. Wade felt the weight of decision pressing down on him like the desert heat. Every choice he made seemed to draw more dangerous attention to Copper Falls and its residents. The town had rallied to support him, but he was beginning to question whether their loyalty would survive the federal response that was surely coming. His contemplation was interrupted by Sheriff Bradley's arrival from the command post, his expression grim with urgent news. Wade, we've got multiple problems developing simultaneously. State authorities are en route with a court order to establish a federal perimeter around the site. We're also tracking 3 separate aircraft circling the area. Military transports that aren't responding to air traffic control. The implications were clear. Federal authorities were preparing to impose martial law around the scrapyard, cutting off media access and civilian support. Wade looked across the site, taking in the research team's desperate efforts to document everything before their work was forcibly terminated. How long do we have? Maybe 2 hours before the first wave arrives. After that, we'll be dealing with federal marshals backed by military force. Bradley's tone carried the frustration of a local lawman watching his jurisdiction being overridden by national politics. Wade, I can't protect you against that kind of response, Doctor. Richardson looked up from the surveillance device, his face pale with realization. They're not just coming to seize the aircraft, they're coming to suppress evidence that could embarrass the entire intelligence establishment. Wade made his decision with the clarity that had served him well in combat situations. Then we make sure the evidence can't be suppressed. Dr. Cooper, how long do you need to extract the data from that storage device? With the right equipment, maybe 30 minutes, but I'd need access to a proper electronics laboratory. The high school, Beth Morrison said suddenly, having overheard the conversation from her position near the excavation. Dylan Carter's been working on advanced computer projects with his technology class. They've got equipment that might work. Wade remembered the teenager from his first day in Copper Falls. Dylan Carter, the son of the missing pilot, whose story was somehow connected to Colonel Mitchell's secrets. The synchronicity felt too convenient to be coincidental. Can you reach him? Beth was already pulling out her phone. Dylan's been following the news coverage. He's been asking his mother if he can help with the archaeological work. The connection was made quickly, and within 20 minutes, Dylan Carter arrived at the scrapyard in his mother's pickup truck. The 16-year-old moved with the focused intensity of someone whose technical skills far exceeded his age. His backpack filled with electronic equipment that looked impressively sophisticated. Mr. Anderson, Dylan said, his voice carrying a mixture of excitement and nervous energy. My mom says you knew Colonel Mitchell. Did he ever mention my father, Captain James Carter? Wade studied the teenager's earnest face, seeing echoes of the missing pilot in the boy's determined expression. Your father's name came up in some of the documents we found. He was involved in the test flights for Operation Silverwing. Dylan's eyes widened with hope and pain. He disappeared in 1952, supposedly on a routine training mission, but my grandmother always said the official story didn't make sense. Dr. Richardson approached with several documents from the aircraft files. Dylan, your father wasn't just a test pilot. According to these records, he was the lead test pilot for all 3 prototypes. His name appears on dozens of flight reports. The teenager's hand shook as he examined the documents containing his father's signature and detailed flight notes. Wade felt a surge of protective instinct toward the young man who was suddenly confronting family mysteries that had been buried for 7 decades. We'll find the truth about your father, Wade promised, but right now, we need your help to preserve evidence before the federal government makes it disappear. Dylan nodded with fierce determination, unpacking his equipment with practiced efficiency. The electronic devices he produced looked like they belonged in a university research lab rather than a high school technology class. Wade was impressed by the teenager's obvious technical expertise. I've been working on data recovery projects for my senior thesis, Dylan explained as he began connecting cables to the surveillance device. Extracting information from obsolete storage systems is kind of my specialty. While Dylan worked, Duke's sharp warning bark drew attention to new movement at the site perimeter. A convoy of black vehicles had arrived, but these weren't government sedans. The cars bore corporate logos and carried teams of people who moved with the efficient purposefulness of private security contractors. Wade recognized the lead figure immediately, Jack Stone, the mercenary who had threatened him days earlier. Stone's expensive suit had been replaced by tactical clothing, and his cold smile suggested that his recent legal troubles had only strengthened his resolve. More mercenaries, Sheriff Bradley observed grimly, adjusting his position to cover the excavation site. Son's employers are making their final move. Let them come, Wade replied, checking his rifle and ensuring Duke was positioned safely. We're not backing down now. The confrontation developed differently than expected. Instead of direct assault, Stone's team established positions around the scrapyard's perimeter and began systematically cutting off escape routes. Their movement suggested a siege rather than an immediate attack, as if they were content to wait for federal authorities to clear out civilian opposition before claiming their prize. They're smart, Wade admitted grudgingly. Let the government do their dirty work, then move in when the legal complications are resolved. Dylan's work proceeded with remarkable speed, his fingers flying across electronic interfaces as he coaxed data from the ancient storage device. The teenager's concentration was absolute, seemingly unaffected by the growing tension around him. Got something, he announced suddenly, his voice tight with excitement. The storage system contains hundreds of hours of recorded surveillance data from 1952. Radio intercepts, photographic reconnaissance, vehicle tracking logs, everything organized by location and date. Dr. Cooper leaned over Dylan's shoulder, studying the data streams appearing on his laptop screen. This is extraordinary. The surveillance was far more comprehensive than anything suggested in the official documents. Wade felt a chill as he realized the full implications. They weren't just testing technology. They were conducting actual operations against American citizens and keeping detailed records. Dr. Richardson added grimly, every conversation intercepted, every photograph taken, every movement tracked. All catalogued with scientific precision. The data revealed surveillance operations targeting political figures, labor organizers, civil rights activists, and ordinary citizens whose only crime was expressing opinions that differed from government policy. The scope was breathtaking in its violation of constitutional protections. Copy everything, Wade ordered. Multiple copies stored in different locations. This evidence needs to survive regardless of what happens to us. Dylan's fingers moved frantically across his equipment, creating digital copies of the surveillance data and uploading them to secure servers. His technical skills were proving invaluable in preserving evidence that powerful people had spent 70 years trying to suppress. The urgency increased as federal aircraft became visible on the horizon, their approach pattern suggesting an imminent landing at the nearby municipal airport. Wade estimated they had perhaps 30 minutes before federal troops arrived to establish their perimeter. Almost finished, Dylan reported, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cooling evening air. The data transfer is taking longer than expected because of the volume involved. Duke's continued alertness suggested that threats were multiplying around them. The German Shepherd's training allowed him to track multiple sources of danger simultaneously, and his body language indicated that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Beth Morrison had been coordinating with the town council through her radio, and her reports painted a picture of federal authorities taking over the entire community. They've established checkpoints on all roads leading to Copper Falls. No one gets in or out without federal clearance. Wade realized that they were effectively under siege, cut off from outside support and facing overwhelming odds. The peaceful archaeological excavation had become a fortress under assault from multiple directions. Data transfer complete, Dylan announced triumphantly. Everything's been copied to secure servers with multiple backup locations. Even if they destroy the original device, the evidence will survive. Wade felt a surge of satisfaction despite the desperate circumstances. Colonel Mitchell's legacy was preserved. The truth about Operation Silverwing would survive, and the American people would eventually learn what their government had done in secret. Good work, Dylan. Now we need to get you out of here before this turns into a war zone. The teenager's expression hardened with determination that reminded Wade powerfully of the missing pilot whose son he was. I'm not leaving, Mr. Anderson. My father died trying to expose this conspiracy. I'm not running away from the truth he died for. Wade looked at the young man who had just proven himself invaluable under pressure, seeing courage that transcended his years. Dylan Carter had inherited more than his father's appearance. He had inherited his father's sense of justice. As federal helicopters appeared in the darkening sky and Stone's mercenaries tightened their perimeter, Wade Anderson prepared for the final battle to protect Colonel Mitchell's legacy. The Desert Wind scrapyard would become either a monument to truth or a grave for those who had fought to preserve it. Federal helicopters thundered overhead as night fell across the desert, their searchlights carving harsh white circles through the darkness. Wade counted 6 aircraft in the immediate area, with more arriving from distant bases every few minutes. The scrapyard had become the center of a massive military operation designed to crush any resistance to federal authority. Frank Gears Thompson arrived at the excavation site just as the first troops began fast roping from helicopters onto the desert floor beyond the perimeter. The elderly mechanic drove his battered pickup truck through terrain that would have stopped most vehicles. Using knowledge of the desert gained through 70 years of life in Copper Falls, figured you might need some local expertise, Frank said as he climbed out of his truck, a heavy toolbox in one weathered hand. Despite his age, the old man moved with the purposeful energy of someone accustomed to solving complex problems under pressure. Wade was surprised to see the mechanic at such a dangerous time. Frank, this isn't a place for civilians. Federal troops are about to storm this position. Been thinking about that aircraft ever since word got around town, Frank replied, ignoring the military activity surrounding them. Something about it bothered me, so I went through my old files, found some interesting paperwork from 1952. He opened his toolbox and withdrew a folder of yellow documents. Their pages brittle with age, but still legible. Dylan Carter looked up from his electronic equipment, drawn by the mention of the year his father had disappeared. What kind of paperwork, Doctor? Richardson asked. Temporarily abandoning his frantic documentation efforts, Frank spread the documents on a makeshift table, his gnarled fingers tracing lines of faded text. Maintenance records for experimental aircraft. My father ran the only independent repair shop between here and Phoenix back then. Government contractors used to bring him work they didn't want traced through official channels. Wade studied the maintenance logs, recognizing aircraft serial numbers that matched the buried prototype. The record showed extensive modifications and repairs conducted in secret, suggesting that the Operation Silverwing aircraft had seen far more use than anyone had suspected. According to these logs, Frank continued, all 3 aircraft were operational for months after the project was supposedly cancelled. They were flying regular missions over populated areas, conducting surveillance operations that went far beyond testing. Dylan's attention was completely focused now, his technical work forgotten as he absorbed the implications. If the aircraft were still flying after the official cancellation, what happened to the pilots? Frank's expression grew somber as he turned to a specific page in his records. That's what worried me. The maintenance logs show increasing mechanical problems, especially with the surveillance equipment. The last entries mention system failures that made the aircraft dangerous to fly. Dr. Cooper joined the group around the maintenance records, her preservation expertise allowing her to handle the fragile documents safely. Frank B's records suggest the aircraft were suffering from fundamental design flaws. The surveillance systems were overheating and causing structural stress, which explains why they were buried instead of being returned to the manufacturers. Wade said grimly, they weren't just experimental prototypes, they were death traps. The revelation cast a darker shadow over the entire Operation Silverwing project. The government hadn't just conducted illegal surveillance, they had risked pilots' lives with defective aircraft and covered up the evidence when the inevitable accidents occurred. Duke's sharp warning bark interrupted their historical analysis. Federal troops were advancing through the scrapyard, their movements coordinated by radio communications that crackled through the night air. Powerful floodlights illuminated the excavation site, turning the peaceful archaeological dig into an interrogation chamber. This is Colonel Crawford, Defense Intelligence Agency, a voice boomed through portable speakers. You are trespassing on a federal crime scene. Surrender immediately, and you will not be harmed. Wade looked around at the people who had risked everything to support his fight for the truth. Dr. Richardson and his team, Dylan Carter with his technical expertise, Frank Thompson with his historical knowledge, Sheriff Bradley maintaining his protective stance despite being vastly outgunned. Duke stood at his side ready to defend his master against any threat. Dr. Richardson, take your people and Frank back to the mobile home. Wade ordered quietly. Dylan, pack up your equipment. If this goes badly, you need to survive to tell the story. I'm not leaving. Dylan said firmly, his voice carrying an echo of his father's courage. Those maintenance records prove my dad was murdered to cover up government crimes. I won't abandon his memory now. Frank Thompson nodded agreement, his elderly hands steady despite the approaching danger. Boy's right, some truths are worth fighting for regardless of the consequences. The federal perimeter tightened around them as Colonel Crawford approached with a squad of armed soldiers. Her military bearing was even more pronounced in the harsh floodlights, and her expression suggested someone prepared to use whatever force necessary to accomplish her mission. Mr. Anderson, you've caused enough trouble, she said as she stopped 20 yards from the excavation site. The aircraft and all related materials are now under federal protection. Your cooperation ends this situation peacefully. Wade stepped forward to meet her. Duke matching his movement with protective loyalty. Colonel, you're seizing evidence of government crimes. That makes you an accessory to covering up constitutional violations. I'm protecting national security, Crawford replied coldly. The surveillance operations conducted under Operation Silverwing were authorized at the highest levels and remain classified for legitimate reasons. Dr. Richardson emerged from the mobile home despite Wes' orders, carrying a folder of copied documents. Colonel Crawford, these maintenance records prove that pilots were killed flying defective aircraft. Are you prepared to cover up murder as well as illegal surveillance? Crawford's expression hardened as she realized the scope of evidence they had assembled. Dr. Richardson, you're interfering with a classified operation. That's a federal crime punishable by life imprisonment. And you're participating in a 70-year cover-up of government crimes. Richardson replied with academic courage. Which side of history do you want to be on? The confrontation was interrupted by unexpected activity at the scrapyard's eastern perimeter. Vehicle headlights were approaching across the desert, moving in convoy formation toward the federal position. Wade counted at least a dozen trucks and SUVs, their approach coordinated but not military in nature. Colonel Crawford spoke urgently into her radio, trying to identify the newcomers. Her troops adjusted their positions to cover multiple approach routes, but their focus remained primarily on the excavation site where Wade and his supporters were making their stand. The convoy resolved into a collection of civilian vehicles carrying what appeared to be local residents and supporters from surrounding communities. Word of the federal siege had spread across social media, drawing people who were outraged by the government's heavy-handed response to a legitimate archaeological discovery. Looks like you've got more trouble than us, Colonel, Wade observed as the civilian vehicles took positions around the federal perimeter. The American people don't like watching their government suppress the truth. Mayor Harold Brennan emerged from one of the lead vehicles accompanied by a woman Wade didn't recognize. The mayor approached the federal checkpoint with the confidence of someone accustomed to political negotiations, while his companion carried herself with the bearing of a legal professional. Colonel Crawford Brendan called out, "I'm Mayor Harold Brendan of Copper Falls. This is Attorney Karen Palmer from the ALU. We're here to ensure that constitutional rights are respected during this operation." Palmer stepped forward, briefcase in hand and law degree evident in her authoritative manner. "Colonel, I have federal court injunctions prohibiting the seizure of private property without due process. This operation exceeds your legal authority." Crawford's frustration was evident as her simple military operation became complicated by legal challenges and civilian resistance. "Attorney Palmer, this is a matter of national security that supersedes local legal concerns." "National security doesn't override the Constitution," Palmer replied firmly. "These injunctions are valid until a federal judge rules otherwise." Wade felt a surge of hope as he realized the battle was shifting from physical confrontation to legal warfare. The arrival of civilian supporters and legal representation changed the dynamics completely, making it much harder for federal authorities to use overwhelming force. Dylan Carter had been monitoring news coverage on his electronic equipment, tracking social media responses to the developing story. "Mr. Anderson, this is going viral worldwide. Desert Truth is trending in 12 countries and major news networks are demanding live access to the site." The teenager's report highlighted the federal government's growing dilemma. Every heavy-handed action was being broadcast to a global audience, making political suppression increasingly costly. Wade recognized the tactical advantage that public attention provided. It was much harder to commit crimes when the whole world was watching. Duke's continued alertness suggested that danger remained high despite the legal maneuvering. The German Shepherd's training allowed him to sense threats that humans might miss, and his body language indicated that the situation remained volatile. Jack Stone's mercenaries were still positioned around the scrapyard's perimeter, waiting for their opportunity to claim the prize. Wade realized that the federal operation might actually provide cover for the private military contractors to accomplish their mission while everyone else was distracted by legal proceedings. "Colonel Crawford," Wade called out, "are you aware that private military contractors are operating in your area of operations? Jack Stone's people have been trying to steal this aircraft for days." Crawford's expression shifted as she became aware of the additional complication. Her military operation was being observed not just by civilian protesters and media, but by hostile forces with their own agenda. "All units expand perimeter security," she ordered into her radio. "We have unidentified hostiles in the operational area." The desert night erupted into chaos as three different factions, federal troops, civilian protesters, and Stone's mercenaries found themselves in an unexpected three-way confrontation. Floodlights swept across the landscape. Radio communications crackled with urgent reports, and the peaceful archaeological site became the center of a complex standoff that no one had anticipated. Woody Anderson stood at the heart of the storm, protecting Colonel Mitchell's legacy while forces beyond his control swirled around him. The truth about Operation Silverwing was preserved in digital files scattered across secure servers, but the physical evidence remained vulnerable to those who would destroy it to protect their secrets. The final battle for the Desert Wind scrapyard was about to begin, and the outcome would determine whether some truths were too dangerous for democracy to survive. The three-way standoff stretched through the early morning hours, each faction maintaining tense positions, while lawyers, military commanders, and corporate representatives engaged in heated negotiations over radio channels. Wade had positioned himself and Duke at the aircraft itself, becoming a human shield between the buried prototype and those who would claim it. The German Shepherd's vigilance never wavered, his amber eyes tracking movement across the complex tactical landscape. Dawn brought unexpected developments that shifted the entire dynamic. A convoy of unmarked trucks approached from the north, moving with military precision, but flying no government flags. Wade recognized the formation patterns from his deployment days. These were private military contractors operating under corporate authority rather than federal oversight. "More players entering the game," Sheriff Bradley observed grimly, adjusting his position to maintain sidelines across the expanding battlefield. The local lawman had spent the night coordinating with civilian supporters while monitoring federal communications, trying to prevent the situation from exploding into open warfare. Dr. Richardson emerged from the mobile home carrying a satellite phone and wearing an expression of shocked amazement. "Wade, I just received a call from Senator Catherine Walsh's office in Washington. The Intelligence Committee is demanding emergency hearings about Operation Silverwing. The political pressure is mounting faster than anyone anticipated." Wade felt a spark of hope despite the desperate circumstances. Political attention from Washington suggested that their fight had transcended local resistance to become a national constitutional crisis. Powerful people were being forced to choose sides between government secrecy and public accountability. Dylan Carter had spent the night monitoring electronic communications across multiple frequencies, his technical skills proving invaluable for intelligence gathering. "Mr. Anderson, I'm intercepting corporate communications between Stone's mercenaries and their headquarters. They're planning to move during shift change when federal attention is focused elsewhere. The teenagers' warning proved prophetic as federal troops rotated positions during their morning briefing. Stone's mercenaries launched a coordinated assault on the excavation site. Their movement was swift and professional, designed to seize the aircraft before anyone could respond effectively. Duke's explosive barking provided the only warning as armed figures emerged from concealment among the scattered debris. Wade brought his rifle to bear, but found himself facing overwhelming odds as mercenaries advanced from multiple directions simultaneously. The firefight that erupted was brief but intense. Sheriff Bradley and his deputies engaged Stone's forces from defensive positions among the aircraft wreckage, while federal troops found themselves caught between hostile factions they had not anticipated. The peaceful archaeological site became a war zone as bullets ricocheted off steel hulks and muzzle flashes strobed through the morning mist. Frank Thompson proved that age had not diminished his courage, using his intimate knowledge of the scrapyard's layout to outflank mercenaries who had underestimated the elderly mechanic. His shotgun boomed across the desert as he provided covering fire for the research team's retreat to safer positions. "Dylan, get to the mobile home," Wade shouted over the gunfire. But the teenager was already moving toward the aircraft with a portable hard drive, determined to preserve the final pieces of evidence even as the battle raged around him. Duke stayed at Wade's side throughout the firefight, his military training evident in the way he remained calm under fire while maintaining protective vigilance. The German Shepherd's presence provided psychological comfort that transcended his tactical value, a reminder that some loyalties endured regardless of circumstances. The engagement ended as suddenly as it had begun when Colonel Crawford's federal troops intervened with overwhelming force. Faced with military assault rifles and coordinated tactics, Stone's mercenaries found themselves outgunned and surrounded. Their corporate employers had sent them against prepared positions without adequate intelligence about federal military presence. "Cease fire, cease fire," Crawford's voice boomed across the scrapyard as her troops systematically disarmed the mercenaries. "All hostile forces will surrender immediately or face the consequences." Stone himself emerged from behind an aircraft engine with his hands raised, his expensive tactical gear torn, and his cold confidence finally shattered. The mercenary leader had gambled everything on a quick strike that had failed spectacularly, leaving him exposed to federal prosecution for armed assault on a military operation. Colonel Crawford, Stone called out as federal soldiers zip-tied his hands. "My employers have legal authorization for recovery operations on this site. We were operating under legitimate corporate authority." Crawford's expression showed no sympathy for the captured mercenary. "Mr. Stone, you just conducted an armed assault on a federal operation. Your corporate authorization doesn't extend to shooting at United States military personnel." Wade lowered his rifle as the immediate threat was neutralized, but he remained alert to the larger political forces still swirling around them. The mercenary attack had eliminated one faction from the complex standoff, but it had also demonstrated the lengths to which powerful interests would go to claim the aircraft. Attorney Palmer approached from the civilian perimeter, her legal briefcase somehow intact, despite the gunfire that had swept across the site. "Colonel Crawford, this attack proves that private interests are willing to use violence to suppress evidence of government crimes. The public has a right to know what's being hidden here. The public has a right to national security," Crawford replied firmly, though her tone suggested uncertainty about the legal complexities involved. "This aircraft contains classified technology that cannot be released without proper authorization." Dr. Cooper had continued her documentation work throughout the firefight, her scientific dedication overriding personal safety concerns. "Colonel, the technology in this aircraft is 70 years old. Any military applications have long since been superseded by modern developments. The only reason to suppress this information is to hide evidence of constitutional violations." Wade realized that the mercenary attack had actually strengthened their position by demonstrating the violent lengths to which corporate interests would go. Public sympathy would favor those who had defended themselves against armed assault rather than those who had initiated violence. Dylan Carter emerged from the mobile home carrying multiple backup drives containing all the surveillance data they had extracted. "Everything's preserved," he announced with fierce satisfaction, multiple copies stored in secure locations. "Even if they destroy the original aircraft, the evidence will survive." The teenager's technical expertise had proven decisive in preserving the historical record, ensuring that Colonel Mitchell's legacy would endure regardless of political pressure or corporate violence. Wade felt profound gratitude toward the young man who had risked everything to honor his father's memory. Mayor Brennan arrived at the excavation site accompanied by a figure Wade hadn't expected. Amy Mitchell, Colonel Bob Mitchell's niece and a commercial airline pilot whose military bearing suggested prior service. Her presence added another layer of complexity to an already intricate situation. "Mr. Anderson," Amy said as she approached, her voice carrying both authority and emotional weight, I'm Amy Mitchell. Uncle Bob left me a letter to be opened only if something happened to the aircraft he had hidden. I think it's time you read it." She handed Wade a sealed envelope bearing his name in Colonel Mitchell's familiar handwriting. The letter felt substantial, suggesting detailed contents that might finally explain the full scope of his inheritance and its implications. Wade opened the envelope carefully, aware that everyone present was watching his reaction. The letter was written in Mitchell's precise military style, but the emotional weight of its contents was immediately apparent. "Wade," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then the secret I've carried for 70 years has finally been exposed. Operation Silverwing was my greatest shame and my heaviest burden. I participated in crimes against the American people, and I've spent decades trying to find a way to make amends." The letter went on to detail Mitchell's role in the surveillance operations, his growing horror at the constitutional violations being committed, and his ultimate decision to preserve evidence that could someday expose the truth. The aircraft hadn't been randomly buried. It had been carefully hidden by a man who knew that someday someone with the courage to fight would need proof of government overreach. "I chose you as my heir because you have the integrity to do what I couldn't." The letter concluded the truth must be told regardless of the personal cost. The American people deserve to know what was done in their name, and they deserve leaders who respect the Constitution they swore to defend. Wade felt the weight of his mentor's final mission settling on his shoulders like familiar gear. Colonel Mitchell hadn't just left him valuable property. He had entrusted him with a sacred duty to expose government crimes and defend constitutional principles. "Colonel Crawford," Wade said, looking up from the letter, "you have a choice to make. You can continue participating in a 70-year cover-up, or you can honor your oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic." Crawford's expression revealed the internal struggle between military loyalty and constitutional duty. She was a career officer who had dedicated her life to serving her country, but she was being asked to betray fundamental American principles to protect institutional secrets. The decision was taken out of her hands by the arrival of federal judges responding to the emergency legal challenges. Judge Helen Brooks had driven through the night from Phoenix, accompanied by court officers and a mobile legal command center that could process constitutional questions in real time. "This is highly irregular," Judge Brooks announced as she surveyed the chaotic scene, "but constitutional crises require immediate judicial intervention. I'm prepared to hold emergency hearings right here to resolve the legal questions involved." Wade realized that the battle for the Desert Wind scrapyard had evolved beyond physical confrontation into a fundamental test of American democracy. The outcome would determine whether government secrecy could override constitutional rights and whether powerful institutions could suppress evidence of their crimes through force and intimidation. Duke sat beside him as legal proceedings began in the desert dawn. The German shepherd's presence, a reminder that some loyalties transcended politics and power. The truth about Operation Silverwing would finally be heard by those with the authority to ensure justice was served. Judge Helen Brooks established her mobile court in the shade of a massive aircraft wing, its twisted metal providing symbolic shelter for proceedings that would determine the fate of constitutional principles. The surreal setting, a federal judge presiding over hearings in an Arizona scrapyard while military helicopters circled overhead, captured the attention of global media outlets broadcasting live coverage to millions of viewers. Wade found himself testifying under oath about his inheritance and the discoveries that had followed, his military bearing evident as he described Colonel Mitchell's final message. Duke lay quietly beside the witness chair, the German shepherd's calm presence providing stability in the chaos of constitutional crisis. "Mr. Anderson," Judge Brooks said, her voice carrying across the makeshift courtroom with absolute authority, "you understand that your testimony describes government surveillance operations that violated numerous constitutional protections." "Yes, Your Honor. The evidence is overwhelming and thoroughly documented." Attorney Palmer presented the surveillance records Dillon had extracted, each piece of evidence carefully catalogued and authenticated by Dr. Richardson's team. The scope of illegal monitoring was staggering. Thousands of American citizens surveilled without warrants, their private communications intercepted, and their movements tracked by government agents operating in complete secrecy. Colonel Crawford sat at the government's table, her military uniform stark against the desert landscape. Her testimony revealed the impossible position she occupied, caught between institutional loyalty and constitutional duty. Forced to defend operations she privately found reprehensible, Colonel Crawford, Judge Brooks, addressed the intelligence officer directly. "Does the Defense Intelligence Agency maintain that these surveillance operations were legally authorized?" Crawford's pause lasted long enough to convey her internal struggle. "Your Honor, the operations were authorized under executive authority existing at the time. However, contemporary legal standards would classify many of these activities as constitutional violations." "Are you saying the government's position has evolved regarding the legality of domestic surveillance without judicial oversight?" "I'm saying that what was considered acceptable in 1952 would not be acceptable today." Dr. Richardson testified about the historical significance of the aircraft and the technology it represented, his academic credentials lending weight to arguments about preserving evidence for future study. His passion for historical truth transcended personal safety, making him a compelling witness for transparency over secrecy. This aircraft represents not just technological innovation, Richardson explained to the court, but documentation of a dark chapter in American history that has never been publicly acknowledged. Destroying this evidence would be equivalent to burning historical documents to protect institutional reputation. Dylan Carter's testimony proved particularly powerful, the teenager's emotional connection to his father's fate resonating with everyone present. His technical expertise in extracting the surveillance data had preserved evidence that might otherwise have been lost forever. "Your Honor," Dylan said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the proceedings, "my father died trying to expose these crimes 70 years ago. If we destroy this evidence now, we're saying that his sacrifice meant nothing." Frank Thompson's maintenance records provided crucial corroboration for the government cover-up. His elderly hands steady as he explained how federal contractors had used his father's repair shop to maintain aircraft that officially didn't exist. The old Mihani's testimony connected contemporary events to historical crimes, demonstrating continuity in government deception. "They brought these aircraft to us for repairs they couldn't explain through official channels," Frank testified. "When the pilots started dying in crashes, they buried the evidence instead of admitting the aircraft were defective." Judge Brooks called a recess to review the extensive documentation, her legal mind grappling with constitutional questions that had implications far beyond the Arizona desert. The global media presence ensured that every word of the proceedings was broadcast to audiences whose outrage was growing with each revelation. During the break, Wade walked among the scattered aircraft debris with Duke at his side, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The German Shepherd's loyalty had been constant throughout their ordeal, a reminder that some relationships transcended the political chaos surrounding them. Amy Mitchell approached during the recess her airline pilot's perspective, providing insight into the technical aspects of her uncle's final mission. Wade, Uncle Bob, left detailed instructions for what should happen if the truth ever came out. He wanted the aircraft preserved as a memorial to the pilots who died, and he wanted the surveillance records made public to prevent similar violations in the future. "Your uncle was a good man caught in an impossible situation," Wade replied. "He spent 70 years carrying guilt that belonged to the people who ordered those operations." Sheriff Bradley joined them, his local law enforcement perspective shaped by the events he had witnessed. "Wade, regardless of what the judge decides, you've accomplished something important here. The truth is out, and no amount of government pressure can put it back in the bottle." Dr. Cooper continued her documentation work even during the legal proceedings, her scientific dedication ensuring that every detail of the aircraft was preserved for historical study. Her expertise had been crucial in understanding the technological innovations that made the surveillance operations possible. The metallurgy alone represents advances that weren't publicly acknowledged for decades. She explained to anyone who would listen, "This aircraft is a museum piece that belongs in the Smithsonian, not buried in some classified warehouse." When court reconvened, Judge Brooks had reached her decision. The constitutional implications were too significant to ignore, and the evidence of government overreach too compelling to suppress. Her ruling would establish precedent for future cases involving classified materials and public accountability. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, Judge Brooks announced, her voice carrying the weight of constitutional authority. "This court finds that the aircraft and associated materials represent historical evidence of government activities that violated constitutional protections." Wade felt his heart pounding as the judge continued her ruling, aware that her words would determine not just his personal fate, but the broader question of whether truth could triumph over institutional secrecy. The surveillance operations documented in these records were conducted without judicial oversight, congressional authorization, or public knowledge. They represent precisely the kind of government overreach that the Constitution was designed to prevent. Colonel Crawford's expression revealed her resignation to the inevitable outcome, her military career likely ending with this public acknowledgement of institutional failure. Her testimony had been honest despite enormous pressure to maintain secrecy, suggesting that even career officers could choose constitutional duty over bureaucratic loyalty. Furthermore, Judge Brooks continued, "The evidence suggests that government officials knowingly covered up pilot deaths resulting from defective aircraft, placing institutional reputation above human life and legal accountability." Dylan Carter's emotional reaction to this official acknowledgement of his father's fate was visible to everyone present. The teenager finally receiving judicial recognition of injustices that had shaped his entire life. Therefore, this court orders that the aircraft and all associated materials be preserved for historical study and public education. The surveillance records will be declassified and made available to academic researchers and the general public. The judge's ruling represented complete victory for Wade and his supporters, establishing that constitutional principles superseded government secrecy when crimes were involved. The Desert Wind scrapyard would become a memorial to transparency rather than a grave for buried truth. Mr. Anderson, Judge Brooks addressed Wade directly, as the legal owner of this property, you bear responsibility for ensuring that this historical evidence is preserved and properly displayed for educational purposes. Wade stood to address the court, Duke rising beside him in automatic response to his master's movement. Your Honor, I accept that responsibility. This aircraft will be preserved as Colonel Mitchell intended, as a reminder that government power must always be subject to constitutional limitations. The courtroom erupted in applause from civilian supporters who had maintained their vigil throughout the legal proceedings. Media representatives transmitted the historic ruling to global audiences whose faith in democratic accountability had been restored by the outcome. Colonel Crawford approached Wade after the formal proceedings concluded, her military bearing intact. Despite the personal cost of her honest testimony, Mr. Anderson, you've done something I didn't have the courage to do. You've chosen truth over convenience. Colonel, you had the courage to testify honestly when it mattered most. That took more guts than anything I did. As the sun reached its zenith over the Arizona desert, the battle for the Desert Wind scrapyard had been won by those who believed that democracy required transparency and accountability. The aircraft would be preserved, the truth would be told, and the American people would finally learn what had been hidden in their name for 70 years. Wade Anderson had inherited more than just valuable property from Colonel Mitchell. He had inherited a mission to defend constitutional principles against all who would subvert them. With Duke at his side and the support of an entire community, he had fulfilled that mission and preserved the truth for future generations. 6 months later, the Desert Wind Memorial Center stood as a testament to the power of truth over institutional secrecy. The experimental aircraft occupied the central display hall, its sleek lines preserved for future generations, while interactive exhibits explained the constitutional violations it had documented. Visitors from around the world came to learn about Operation Silverwing and the courageous individuals who had exposed government overreach. Wade Anderson walked through the memorial with Duke at his side, their morning routine now including security rounds through exhibits that honored both technological innovation and democratic accountability. The German Shepherd had adapted to his new role as unofficial greeter, his calm demeanor helping visitors understand the serious historical lessons contained within the Ent's walls. Dr. Paul Richardson served as the memorial's director of historical research, his academic expertise ensuring that the Operation Silverwing story was told with scholarly precision and emotional impact. The historian had found his life's work in preserving evidence of government surveillance programs that contemporary citizens needed to understand. The response has been overwhelming, Richardson told Wade as they reviewed visitor statistics in the center's administrative office. We're hosting school groups, university researchers, and constitutional law classes from across the country. The educational impact exceeds our most optimistic projections. Dylan Carter had received a full scholarship to study computer engineering at Arizona State University, his technical skills in data recovery having impressed admissions committees and corporate recruiters alike. The teenager spent his summers working at the memorial, sharing his father's story with visitors who needed to understand the personal cost of government secrecy. Mr. Anderson, Dylan said during his break from leading a tour group, I got a letter from the Air Force yesterday. They're planning to name a scholarship program after my father, the Captain James Carter Memorial Award for aviators who demonstrate exceptional courage in exposing safety violations. Wade felt profound satisfaction at this official recognition of Dylan's father's sacrifice. The pilot who had died trying to expose dangerous aircraft defects was finally receiving the honor he deserved. His legacy preserved for future generations of military aviators. Frank Thompson had become the memorial's resident expert on 1950s aircraft maintenance, his elderly hands still steady as he demonstrated restoration techniques for visiting mechanics and aviation enthusiasts. The old man's knowledge bridged the gap between historical events and contemporary understanding. Been thinking about those other 2 aircraft Frank mentioned during one of their conversations. The maintenance records suggest they might be buried somewhere in the Sonoran Desert, probably within 50 mi of here. Wade nodded, aware that the Operation Silverwing story remained incomplete until all 3 prototypes were accounted for. Ground-penetrating radar surveys were planned for the coming year with archaeological teams prepared to conduct systematic searches of the region. Beth Morrison's Diner had become an unofficial visitor center for memorial tourists, her establishment benefiting from the economic development that historical tourism brought to Copper Falls. The small desert town had transformed from a forgotten highway stop into a destination for people interested in constitutional history. Never imagined this place would become famous for anything, Beth remarked as she served Wade his usual coffee during his weekly visit. But I'm glad it happened. People need to understand what you accomplished here. Sheriff Tom Bradley had been elected to the county commission, his role in defending constitutional rights during the scrapyard crisis having elevated his political profile throughout Arizona. His experience with federal overreach had made him a sought-after speaker on law enforcement and civil liberties issues. We were getting requests from other communities dealing with government secrecy, Bradley mentioned during one of their discussions. Apparently, your fight inspired people to challenge official narratives in their own areas. The memorial's impact extended far beyond local tourism. Constitutional law scholars referenced the Desert Wind case in academic papers about government transparency, while civil liberties organizations used the story to illustrate the importance of protecting whistleblowers and preserving historical evidence. Dr. Lisa Cooper had accepted a permanent position at the memorial, her restoration expertise ensuring that the aircraft remained in pristine condition for future study. Her work had attracted international attention from aviation museums and military historians who wanted to understand the technological innovations of Operation Silverwing. We're developing partnerships with aerospace engineering programs, Cooper explained to Wade during one of her detailed briefings. Students are analyzing the aircraft's design principles to understand how 1950s innovations influenced modern aviation development. Amy Mitchell visited the memorial regularly, her uncle's final letter displayed prominently among the exhibits that explained Colonel Bob Mitchell's transformation from participant to whistleblower. The airline pilot had become an advocate for aviation safety transparency, using her professional platform to promote accountability in military and civilian aircraft programs. Uncle Bob would be proud of what you've accomplished, Amy told Wade during her most recent visit. He carried guilt about Operation Silverwing for 70 years, but your courage turned his burden into something that serves the public good. The memorial's educational programs included workshops on constitutional rights, government accountability, and the historical importance of preserving evidence even when powerful institutions preferred secrecy. Wade often spoke to visiting groups about the ordinary citizen's responsibility to defend democratic principles. The Constitution isn't just a document in Washington, he would tell student audiences. It's a living commitment that requires each generation to defend the principles our founders established. Sometimes that defense happens in courtrooms, sometimes in voting booths, and sometimes in Arizona scrapyards. Duke had become something of a celebrity himself, his role in discovering the buried aircraft, making him the subject of children's books and educational videos about the importance of perseverance and loyalty. The German Shepherd accepted the attention with typical canine dignity, more interested in his daily walks through the memorial grounds than in his growing fame. The financial benefits from the memorial had transformed Witt's life completely. The federal court's ruling had established his clear ownership of the aircraft and all associated materials, while educational partnerships and tourism revenue provided sustainable income for memorial operations. More importantly, the purpose and meaning he had found in preserving historical truth had healed psychological wounds that military discharge and civilian adjustment had left unresolved. Jack Stone and his mercenaries had been convicted on multiple federal charges, their corporate employers exposed as part of an international network that specialized in acquiring classified technologies through illegal means. Congressional investigations triggered by the Desert Wind revelations had led to reforms in how government contractors handled sensitive materials. Victor Sterling, the mysterious figure behind Stone's operations, had disappeared into the labyrinth of international shell companies and offshore accounts that protected wealthy criminals from accountability, but his network's exposure had made it much harder for similar operations to target archaeological discoveries or historical evidence. Colonel Patricia Crawford had testified before congressional committees about Defense Intelligence Agency operations, her honest testimony leading to significant reforms in how military intelligence agencies handled domestic surveillance capabilities. Her career had ended, but her final service had been to constitutional principles rather than institutional secrecy. Senator Catherine Walsh had sponsored legislation requiring declassification of historical documents related to domestic surveillance programs, with the Desert Wind case serving as the primary example of how government secrecy could conceal constitutional violations across multiple decades. As the first anniversary of the aircraft's discovery approached, Wade reflected on the journey that had transformed his quiet inheritance into a national memorial for democratic accountability. Standing in the memorial's main hall with Duke beside him, he read Colonel Mitchell's final letter displayed under protective glass for visitors to study. The letter's conclusion remained as powerful as the day Wade had first read it in the desert dawn. The truth must be told regardless of the personal cost. The American people deserve to know what was done in their name, and they deserve leaders who respect the Constitution they swore to defend. A group of elementary school students was touring the exhibits, their young voices filled with questions about the aircraft and the constitutional principles it represented. Their teacher was explaining how ordinary citizens could make extraordinary differences when they had the courage to stand up for what was right. Wade watched the children examine the aircraft with wonder and curiosity, their innocence reminding him why the fight for truth had been worth every moment of danger and uncertainty. These young Americans would inherit a democracy strengthened by transparency, their constitutional rights protected by the president established in an Arizona scrapyard. Duke's contentment was evident in the way he interacted with visitors, his gentle nature making him an ideal ambassador for the memorial's educational mission. The German shepherd, who had discovered buried secrets, had found his true calling in helping others understand the importance of preserving truth. As evening approached and the last visitors departed, Wade and Duke walked the perimeter of the memorial grounds, their security patrol a peaceful end to another day of serving the public good. The desert sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple, a natural beauty that provided appropriate backdrop for reflecting on the enduring value of constitutional principles. The Desert Wind Memorial Center stood as proof that democracy required eternal vigilance from ordinary citizens willing to defend extraordinary principles. WWII Anderson, a broken veteran who had inherited more than he ever imagined, had fulfilled Colonel Mitchell's final mission and preserved the truth for generations yet to come. Some legacies are measured in money, others in monuments of stone and steel. But the greatest legacies are those that strengthen the foundation of freedom itself, ensuring that government power remains subject to the consent of the governed and the protection of individual rights. In the quiet desert evening, with Duke at his side and the truth finally told, Wade Anderson knew that he had honored both his mentor's memory and his own oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The fight had been won, the truth preserved, and democracy strengthened by the courage of those who refused to let powerful secrets remain buried in the sand. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoy this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch, and don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.